Thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Zagajewski. I am a Senior Solutions Architect for Winslow Technology Group. And with me is Jeff Miller, Channel Account Manager for Arctic Wolf Networks. Today, we will talk about the recently proposed updates to the New York State Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Statute, better known as the 23rd chapter of the New York Code Rules and Regulations, Part 500, which details cybersecurity requirements for financial services companies. Before we jump into today's topic, I will start off with a brief overview of Winslow Technology Group, especially helpful if you're joining us for the first time, and then hand the mic over to Jeff so he can dive into the update to this very important legislation and its implications. A couple of housekeeping items. First, please send us your questions via the Q&A feature of this webinar so we can answer them at the end, time allowing, of course. And second, if we do not get to your question, we will be sure to respond via email as quickly as possible. So a few words about Winslow Technology Group. We were founded by Scott Winslow for about 20 years ago as a technology solutions provider headquartered in Waltham, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. We have a distributed workforce with satellite offices in Charlotte, North Carolina, New York City, and Washington, D.C. We specialize in hardware, software, and services, not only for the core data center, but also end user compute, complemented by our cybersecurity, disaster recovery, and cloud solutions. We strive to identify and develop expertise in what we call game-changing technologies, and our partnership with industry leaders such as Arctic Wolf being a great example of that, all so that we can bring you the best possible outcome together. And part of that overall outcome now is our recently launched WTG Financial Services, which provides customized financing solutions to enhance your buying power. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, if you would.
All right, good morning, everybody. We're so thankful to have you here today. This is Jeff Miller, Northeast Channel Manager for Arctic Wolf Networks. We're here today to talk about the proposed Second Amendment, as Alex talked about, to the New York State Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirements. We do expect this to be passed sometime this fall or later this year. The proposed Second Amendment has gone through a public comment period, and the New York State Department of Financial Services is currently reviewing those public comments and making any adjustments as needed, just like they did the first round back when it was first passed. So for today, we have 5 things on our agenda. The first thing is just to recap the regulation and kind of take you back to why we have it, what was the purpose of the regulation, the heart behind it. We'll talk about what's new. So the first iteration of the regulation was a little over 15 pages or so. The new regulation is about 20 pages. So we'll talk about what those underlines are, and in other words, what you need to do to get yourself compliant. There is a phased rollout period here with this new amendment, so you don't have to comply with everything today, although you should be planning towards that so that you don't have to hurry up and do vendor selection on things that you might have gaps on when it's too late. We'll talk through some frequently asked questions, and then we'll talk about how we can help you out together. So with that, we'll get started on the actual content here. So just rewinding, the Department of Financial Services was a consolidation of New York State's banking and insurance departments back in 2011 under Andrew Cuomo. They surveyed 43 insurance institutions between 2013 and 2014, and the goal was to better understand the cybersecurity posture of New York's financial services marketplace as a whole. The goal was just to really get a handle on what people are doing around cybersecurity. In early 2015, they set up 16 cybersecurity guidelines, and then in March of 2017, the regulation, formerly known as 23 NYCRR 500, was ratified, borrowing heavily from those initial 16 guidelines. So this regulation applies to the organizations you see on screen here. So anybody that is on this call today, if you are under one of these listed types of companies, this law applies to you. So covered entities still have to comply with New York State regulations, regardless of whether or not you are regulated by other entities. So I've had questions in the past like, hey, Jeff, I'm bound by the FTC or I'm bound by the SEC requirements. Do I have to comply with this? And the answer is yes. And it's explicitly yes in the new amendment. So there's no way of wiggling out of this. If you are anybody who is operating under or required to operate under a license, registration, charter, certificate, permit, accreditation, or similar authorization under any of these three New York State laws, this applies to you. So in terms of what's new now, so this is kind of like, these are the underlines. So when we go from the 15 pages of the initial regulation to what the proposed Second Amendment is, this is kind of where the DFS has their head. So number one, if you're a large organization, and by the way, if you're a small organization, don't tune out here. These things are all good to do anyway. But if you're a large organization, you have to comply with heightened standards. The New York State DFS calls these Class A companies. If your company meets the revenue and employee counts listed, your New York State DFS audits cannot be performed in-house, but must be performed by an external auditor on an annual basis. Furthermore, Section 500.07 adds a plethora of new requirements around privilege access management. For Class A companies, this includes monitoring privilege access activity and implementing a privilege access management solution, otherwise known as a PAM. And a PAM is an identity security solution that helps protect organizations against cybersecurity threats by monitoring, detecting, and preventing unauthorized privilege access to critical resources. PAM works through a combination of people, processes, and technology, and gives you visibility into who is using privileged accounts and what they are doing while they are logged in. Lastly, Class A companies must also deploy an endpoint detection and response solution to monitor for anomalous activity on endpoints. EDR logs, along with Active Directory logs and other security telemetry, must be centralized, correlated, time-stamped, and managed by a team capable of sifting through the false positives and bubbling up true incidents. This is precisely what Arctic Wolf does every day with our concierge security team. Another thing that's new here, and this is something that I actually really like, the New York State did well by expanding the authority granted to CISOs at covered entities. In Section 500.04, it now gives CISOs both decision-making and budgetary authority to maintain a sufficient cybersecurity program. Not all organizations have a CISO, we understand that. So in this case, the amendment is referring to the qualified individuals or individual responsible for overseeing the covered entity's cybersecurity program. This should really help CISOs moving forward with obtaining the financial, technical, and human resources needed to carry out an effective cybersecurity program. So there should be no more infighting between CIO and CISO or other leaders within an organization. The DFS is saying the CISO has the right to budget for and execute on closing any cybersecurity gaps that your organization may have. So I actually look at this as a positive. Section 500.07 of the amendment really digs into the concept of least privilege. Now, this isn't something new. This is something that the military has been doing for decades at this point. This concept boils down into giving users only the privileges within information systems necessary for them to perform their job. The Department of Defense has rules in place to implement least privilege for decades. So now it's finally making its way into public sector companies. This is the broader concept of zero trust. People, if you have received an email lately, you've probably received an email from a technology organization about zero trust. And that's little more than what least privilege is. So banking, insurance, and FinServ companies should be implementing least privilege. What that means is, again, people only have access to do the things that they need to do to get their job done and no more. Class A companies are also required to implement formal privilege access management solutions, like we said in an earlier slide, and automatically block commonly used passwords for all accounts. And what you see in this table on the right-hand side when we talk about password complexity is how easy it is to crack passwords because of the sheer compute power of the cloud these days. Distributed services like AWS and Azure, it's easy for hackers to crack passwords that are even up to 12 characters in length. So if you look about midway down, it can take minutes, days, or just a short period of months to crack anything that's 12 or fewer characters. So your password complexity policy should take that into effect. Also, with the advent of quantum computing, it'll be any second now until even longer passwords are no longer valid. Moving along, so Class A, again, the DFS is looking not just at where sort of the middle of the bell curve is, but they're looking at these larger companies and also the smaller companies. So on the smaller side of things, they have redefined what a limited exemption organization looks like. So you see listed here the old and the new version of what the New York State considers a limited exempt covered entity. Back in 2017, a lot of smaller covered entities objected to parts of the regulation, and this is the whole point of the public comment period. It allows the DFS to receive those objections and listen to what the public has to say. The smaller organizations back in 2017 felt like it would be too expensive and burdensome to do everything that was required and still be profitable. In other words, if I'm spending all my time and money securing myself, how am I going to make any money? The New York State DFS modified the original regulation to include a limited exemption clause, exempting entities with low employee counts, revenue, or year-end assets from sections of the law. In the Second Amendment to the New York State DFS cybersecurity regulation, the limited exemption now applies to covered entities with fewer than 20 employees. Again, it was formerly 10 employees, so that bar has been raised. Fewer than $5 million in annual revenue, this didn't change, or fewer than $15 million in year-end assets. This went up from $10 million in the original regulation. Any entity that believes that they are qualified for the limited exemption status must file an electronic notice to the DFS website, which is dfs.ny.gov. Again, a lot of new things here. We added 5 more pages of regulation, but like some of these things are so good and so important that, and a lot of you are probably doing them already, maybe just not all the way. So I do look at this regulation as a high quality amendment, and I don't look at it as over-regulation or overreach. I do think that these are good things. That being said, multi-factor authentication requirements have been greatly expanded since the first iteration of the DFS cybersecurity regulation. Section 500.12 specifically was expanded to tighten the DFS's definition of MFA, in other words, multi-factor authentication, in terms of how and what to protect with MFA. First of all, there are very limited cases that I can think of where MFA shouldn't be in place. So if you look at section 500.12, the quote unquote, except where reasonable equivalent controls caveat is listed, that shouldn't be taken as a loophole for not deploying MFA. In fact, in almost all cases, failure to implement MFA will result in a lack of insurability for cyber liability insurance or drastically higher insurance rates for your organization. So don't be penny wise, pound foolish. If you're not implementing MFA properly, you either won't be insurable or your insurance rates will go through the roof, which will be far higher than the cost of implementing MFA in the first place. So just the mere fact of reducing cyber insurance costs should cause you to want to deploy MFA as a covered entity. What section 500.12 does in the Second Amendment is simply to call out the importance of MFA on remote applications such as cloud-based email, accessing internal systems via remote monitoring and management tools, and it also requires MFA on all privileged accounts. Speaking of privilege, I've had the privilege of speaking to the Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts Bankers Associations and Maine in the last, since November. I'll actually be out with the Massachusetts Bankers here later this week in Boston. When I'm talking to people, there's a lot of questions around what is a privileged account. So let's just talk about that. A privileged account is basically a doorway into your organization's kingdom, so to speak. It's the place where sensitive information is stored. And as such, they need to be very secure. A privileged user is one that's authorized and therefore trusted to perform security relevant functions that ordinary users are not authorized to perform. For example, your local Windows admin accounts and domain admin accounts are example of privileged accounts. Other examples would be Linux or Unix root accounts, server firewall, or other admin accounts. And then don't forget the cloud. Administrative consoles such as Azure, AWS, Office 365, Okta, Duo, those are also privileged accounts and should be protected with multi-factor authentication. If you could throw away everything else and do one thing right, in my opinion, it would be this right here. So many of the attacks that we're seeing at Arctic Wolf are because MFA is improperly configured or not configured at all. And it is the lowest cost thing with the highest return on investment, if you ask me. Moving on from MFA, encryption has now gotten a highlight in the new amendment. And there's still some wiggly language here. So section 500.15 adds the phrase, quote unquote, meets industry standards when talking about encryption. So if you're a covered entity, you have to use encryption, but what does that mean? So as an industry expert, Alex and I can help you out here. If you're confused, you might see these bolded terms on the bottom and say, what is AES? What is Al-Gamal? What is this? Don't worry. Encryption is very important though, especially with quantum computing developments threatening to break encryption as we know it. Shorter encryption lengths are no longer viable. So the bit strengths that you see here are considered minimum. They shouldn't be considered the ceiling, but the basement. Shorter encryption lengths are no longer viable, like I said, because of the advances in quantum computing and the computing power that allows hackers to break the encryption keys. So different encryption algorithms are employed for different use cases. We're not going to digress for the sake of today's webinar, but feel free to reach out to us after the webinar for further discussion. I will say though, on the note of application encryption, it involves the use of an encryption library and a key retrieval service. Encryption at the application layer fundamentally means that you're encrypting data before inserting it into a database or other storage mechanism and decrypting it after you retrieve the data. This provides a very granular level of control to sensitive data. So think about the kinds of data that you, as somebody regulated by the DFS stores. It's a lot of personally identifiable information, credit and debit card information to fill out loan applications, things like that. So it's very important that you have the types of encryption that you see on the top left here. Too long didn't read, or in other words, the bottom line. You should do an audit of the encryption being used at your organization. And if you find yourself below the standards just discussed, you have some work to do, and we can help. Moving on from encryption, the New York State DFS Second Amendment is section 500.13 initially it focused on disposing data that was no longer needed for business purposes. It was literally a sentence and a half. It wasn't much more than that. So the idea there was to reduce your exposure, right? So you might be familiar with FOIL or the Freedom of Information Law. And the idea is if you have too much data for too long, it puts you at legal risk, right? If somebody does a legal discovery, you can get in trouble, right? If you have too much data. So section 500.13 essentially initially said back in 2017, delete anything you don't need for legit business purposes. And then it moved on to the next section. So this section got a major facelift in the proposed Second Amendment. Special care must now be taken to track several key data points of each asset within the covered entity's information systems. The goal of this expanded section is to enact more prescriptive asset management requirements for covered entities. The proposed changes emphasize the importance of maintaining visibility of the covered entity's assets and their potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses. And now you might look at this and say, this seems burdensome. However, what it does is it forces covered entities to get a real grasp on what's in their environment, right? You can't protect what you don't know is there. It also forces people to consider the value of each asset and budget protections around those assets according to recovery time requirements. For example, it may be more important to get your servers up and running immediately after a downtime or a breach, but your printers and other type workflows, your recovery times may be longer. Not all systems are critical, and not all systems require the same amount of attention as others. So I do think that this is a very important part of business continuity planning, to understand what's important and what can wait. Moving on from there, of course, the threat landscape has changed since the initial survey back in 2013 and 2014, and when the initial regulation was passed in 2017. We've seen a lot of new types of threats from these very creative hacking groups. So Section 500.14 deals with monitoring for cyber threats and training users on common cyber threats, such as phishing and social engineering. One of the key things here is that EDR is not enough to detect malicious code execution on its own. It can in certain cases. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a customer who their EDR tool was supposed to detect something, and it was bypassed, and the Arctic Wolf platform picked it up and saw it. So EDR is critical, yes, but only 15% of the threats that we, Arctic Wolf, respond to across our over 4,000 customers globally have a root point of compromise that's picked up by EDR. The other 85% of initial attack vectors are coming in through network traffic, cloud apps, and identity providers like Active Directory, multi-factor authentication, and other authentication services. So it's important to have an EDR tool monitoring for malicious activity on your endpoints, but that needs to be coupled with an MDR, or managed detection and response solution, for broader visibility to be truly effective at looking at your entire attack surface. The great thing is that EDR, MDR, and centralized security logging will materially lower your cyber insurance rates and help your organization be insurable for years to come. Take a look at your upcoming cyber insurance renewal. You will likely see something in there about MFA. I do like to see social engineering exercises specifically called out in the new amendment. However, I don't think it does enough, frankly. The DFS requires at least annual awareness training to be performed. At Arctic Wolf, we did some research and found that roughly 80% of adult learners will forget what they learned unless positively reinforced within a 4-week or shorter window. Now, if you want to go and check our math, this is something known as the Ebbinghaus forgetfulness curve. This is scientific. So the industry could do better by providing more bite-sized training modules more frequently versus a once-a-year training that people will all but forget in the months after taking it. And so ask yourself, how am I deploying security awareness training? Are people getting positive reinforcement at least once every 4 weeks? If the answer is no, you have work to do. Gartner also did a study and found that implementing socio-behavioral tactics like leaderboards and micro rewards can help people retain information better. That's how our platform does it. This is the same concept used in the popular language learning app Duolingo. In fact, I was shamed this morning on the way to do this presentation that I hadn't logged in to do my learning lesson, so I went in and did it. Moving on from that, perhaps the biggest section in terms of sheer number of characters added to the new regulation, well, I should say the Second Amendment, is the focus on incident response and business continuity planning. So Section 500.16 is where this can be found. This section deals with IR planning and business continuity. And now IR plans need to be written so that the common types of threats are considered and detected and have a recovery plan from such events. And that needs to be spelled out in detail. So again, the regulation is becoming far more prescriptive than the 2017 version. I think this is good. In fact, I was looking at, and you can take a look at my LinkedIn, Jeff Miller, Arctic Wolf. I posted a couple days ago. One main financial group last Thursday, May 25th, just incurred a $4.25 million fine for lack of proper planning, for lack of MFA, for several of the things that we're talking about today. So to avoid these hefty fines, You need to have these things in place. These are non-negotiable. In terms of when you're writing an IR plan, the most common threats today are remote access due to internet-facing vulnerabilities, ransomware, extortion is growing like crazy. In other words, I'm going to get your data out there unless you give me money. So it's no longer just we're going to decrypt your data and you're going to pay for or we're going to encrypt your data and you're going to pay for a decryption key. It's now paired with extortion where we're going to get your data out in the public unless you pay us. The other thing is business email compromise that continues to be on top, and of course, social engineering. Every covered entity should have a decision tree built out for these common incident types as required by the addendum to New York State DFS cyber law. IR plans also have to now address recovery from backups. This is new. Several vendors today have immutable backups, and if you talk to Alex and the Winslow crew, they can help you out with that. So the ability to detect ransomware from backups, immutable backups, that's a progressed technology from what we had in 2017. Business continuity is a different beast altogether from incident response, where IR is focused more on immediate disruption and getting back up and running, or preventing or containing a breach. Business continuity and disaster recovery plans address long-term disruptions. Think of Hurricane Sandy, think of COVID-19, things like that. So any kind of extended site-wide outages due to natural disasters or things like global pandemics, or where large groups of people must change the way they do business for extended timeframes, that's where you would need a larger business continuity and disaster recovery plan. And in New York State law, once this gets passed, both IR and BCDR plans must be tested annually, not just written and sitting on the shelf to collect dust. Now, in terms of rollout, so that's kind of what's new in a nutshell. In terms of rollout, you can see that based on the section numbers within the regulation, and I've put in parentheses on the right, so if you don't know what section 500.17 is, you can see the parentheses here. But the rollout is a phased rollout. This is no different than what covered entities had to do upon the initial regulation passed in 2017. So we do expect this, if the pass is any indication of the future, we do expect this amendment to be ratified this year. Once the amendment is ratified, the rollout timeline will be 30 days to comply with section 500.17, which is notice of a cybersecurity event, a year to comply with the immutable backup section, and then 18 months to comply with a majority of the other sections here. And notice that the scanning for vulnerabilities is now required to be automated. So no longer these point in time, once in a while vulnerability scans with months in between. Automated is the key here. CISO review of the security program has to be done annually. MFA on remote access and cloud workflows and privilege accounts, etc. Protection against malicious code, and EDR for Class A companies, although I think everybody should have EDR. You have 18 months for those sections, and then 2 years to comply with section 500.13. So again, this is a phased rollout. What I do suggest is, I know it takes time when you're selecting vendors and looking at different gaps that you might have. Start looking at those things today. You know that this is likely to be ratified by the end of the year. It's going to take time to go through vendor selection. It makes sense to look at the things that we're talking about today and understand where your gaps are, and start to go down the path of understanding what vendors are out there. I mentioned the $4.25 million fine that one main financial group had last Thursday. That was all over the news. That was on the DFS website. If you're a member of the New York Bankers Association, the newsletter that went out highlighted that as well. They do a great job getting out very timely and pertinent information in their newsletters. But the non-compliance part of this new regulation it's nearly a page long. Essentially, the proposed amendment allows for mitigating factors to be considered in the calculation of a penalty, but the violation remains nonetheless. Much like HIPAA, fines are steeper for willful negligence and repeat offenders. So this $4.25 million fine levied against one main financial group if you check out that press release on the DFS website, there was certainly willful negligence. They had not done things, falsely attested to their cybersecurity program, and continued to not do things properly, knowing that they weren't doing them and they were in violation of DFS requirements. So their fine was very significant. And so the idea here is that the fine will take into effect some of these things here. So if you're cooperating during a breach, you're not brushing things under the rug and trying to lie. They say good faith, which if you look it up in the dictionary, we should all be doing this. This is honesty and sincerity, which is the best way to act if there is a breach. If it was accidental versus intentional, prior violations, and so on. So the fines will go up if you're acting inappropriately. Outside of the one from one main financial group last Thursday, I've just picked out a few other breaches that occurred, and New York State DFS is levying very significant fines. I don't think anybody on this on our program today wants to have $1 million or multi-million-dollar fine. And you can see lack of accountability, failure to conduct risk assessments, failure to report a breach, failure to implement multi-factor authentication, falsely attesting to compliance. So, if you're anybody outside of Class A organizations, you have to go and self-attest every April on the DFS web portal. If you go and lie and say that you're doing things that you're not doing to be compliant, and they find out, you get breached and they find out, those penalties go significantly higher. Now, in terms of FAQs, so again, if you are required to comply with DFS, it doesn't matter. They don't really care what other government entities might be telling you that you have to do other things. So if you're regulated by the SEC, do I also have to comply with the New York State DFS requirements? The answer is yes. And that's specifically spelled out in the new regulation. So I actually had that question a couple of weeks ago. What is continuous monitoring? A lot of people wonder what is that? So if I'm monitoring for threats, effective continuous monitoring generally has the ability, and this is DFS's definition, not Jeff Miller's. Effective continuous monitoring generally has the ability to continuously, on an ongoing basis, detect changes or activities within a covered entity's information systems that may create or indicate the existence of cybersecurity vulnerabilities or malicious activity. And then, well, how do I do cybersecurity, right? Like, what is the framework? What is the standard? And if you're in the financial sector, the FFIEC cyber assessment tool is the best route to take. There's the CRI profile, and of course, for the whole world, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was just updated to 2.0 version just a few weeks ago, is sort of the gold standard. So if you're not sure, how to do all this and how to prioritize what to do and build it into a framework, use one of the frameworks listed here. If you are an entity that is outside of New York, as long as you have a branch within New York, you could be somebody in Connecticut, Northern Jersey. I've had people call me on the phone from Florida saying, hey, I need to comply with New York State DFS because they're licensed to do insurance policies in the state of New York. Or, it could be, you could be a bank in Boston, but you have a New York branch office. It's the fact that you're doing business within the state of New York that means the DFS has the right to examine you and make sure that you have to comply with this new requirement. Now, how can we help? So that was all the homework, right? All the things that are new in this new regulation, the additional 5 pages of things that the DFS is causing to make it more of a prescriptive framework for you to follow. So that's what the DFS is saying. Arctic Wolf and Winslow can really help out if you found yourself writing notes in terms of gaps. Again, the vulnerability management component is now, the word automated is in there. So if you're doing point-in-time vulnerability scans, perhaps Tenable or Nessus or Qualys, and they're once a month, and a lot of the bankers that I've spoken to, that's kind of how their environment is. Continuous is better, right? When you're scanning nonstop for vulnerabilities in the environment, you'll pick something up way faster than if you're waiting a month to do your next scan. Robust incident response. So having a plan is one thing, but then having a team that can go in and respond to the ransomware, negotiate with the threat actors, prevent the extortion from happening, etc. That's important. We can help you there. Cybersecurity log collection and 24/7 threat monitoring, that's where we can help as well. If you are not comfortable writing an incident response plan and maintaining it over time, we can help you there. And our team of over 500 cybersecurity experts can provide guidance as well and bring you on this journey. Lastly, we talked about the effectiveness of security awareness training. If you're honest with yourself, you're probably not training your employees as regularly as you should. So effective security awareness training that positively reinforces topics at least once every 4 weeks is what's required for effective adult learning. So that's how we can help over here. Now we'll have Alex talk about how Winslow Technology Group can overlay across all 5 pillars of the NIST framework.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a lot of really, really great content. And the one key takeaway that I'm reading from all of this material is that the state is becoming very, very keenly aware of not only what is required, but also the threats that we may be facing. And perhaps, going a step further is they're actually formalizing and codifying into law what a lot of folks might have been doing as good standard business practices in terms of running their infrastructure. And in that vein, while we're digesting all of this, one next logical step would be to consider Winslow's own cybersecurity practice that Jeff just mentioned. And as he correctly put, it is in fact based on the NIST cybersecurity framework seen here. We do offer a variety of technology and services, including those provided by our friends at Arctic Wolf, which line up very nicely with these 5 pillars in a layered approach, which, as everyone will attest, is the way to address cybersecurity. So complementing our data center and end user compute solutions so that we provide our customers with a cost-effective, organized, and comprehensive cybersecurity program. Now, speaking of complementary services, our NorthStar MS program is the co-managed technology service that provides an affordable support and management solution, especially in today's age when IT teams and budgets are stretched thin. Our services will augment your team to reduce risk, increase efficiency, and provide peace of mind for both the business executive and IT teams alike, as we not only take the mundane tasks off your plate, allowing you to focus on more strategic and higher priority projects, but also provide expert advice for mission critical needs as they arise. So combining Arctic Wolf's platform with our cybersecurity and NorthStar MS services is our better together approach to providing an efficient and secure infrastructure, allowing you to focus on what matters to your business. Now, if you're still unsure where to begin or how to continue your own cybersecurity journey, including complying with these future new laws, I'd like to suggest starting with Winslow's complimentary NIST cybersecurity assessment. This is about an hour-long consultative interview, and it will help you identify areas for improvement, as well as answer your top-of-mind questions. So don't wait and contact your account executive today. So we've reached the last slide in our presentation, but we did have a few questions come in during the course of the presentation. So Jeff, with your leave, I'll just read them out to you. The first one was, if one complies with the NYCRR 500, does that mean that one is therefore complying with the New York State SHIELD law that we talked about a year or two ago?
Yes, both of them are essentially based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. I like the new 23 NYCRR 500 because it is more prescriptive. So if you're doing what is required of you here and generally following the NIST framework, then yes, then it would basically put you in compliance with the SHIELD Act.
Excellent. All right, cool. Next question. Our organization qualifies for an exemption under 500.19. Does that mean that they're also exempt from MFA for privileged accounts?
The exemption on section 500.19 does spell out what sections, so 500.4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15, and 16. MFA, I'm looking through the regulation right now. Multi-factor authentication, I believe, is required for all covered entities. It's also something that if you're going to do anything in this entire regulation, that would be the one thing I would not try to side skirt. It is the most important piece of the regulation, in my opinion. I'm just looking through real quick on MFA. Section 500.12 is where MFA is. 500.19 is the exemption, limited exemption. And no, it is, you are not exempted from MFA. Everyone has to do it. Good thing is it's very, very inexpensive to carry out.
Yeah, that's one of those things we like to call low-hanging fruit. You know, you get a lot of bang for your buck. So absolutely true. So again, just to restate, the answer is no, you are not exempt from MFA requirements, even if exempted under 500.19. And the last question was actually someone just asking a little bit of clarification, which was where did the information on the $4.25 million fine come from? And if they can find more data, I believe Jeff mentioned that it is very much posted on his LinkedIn profile. Also, if one were just to Google One Main Financial, you should be able to find copious amounts of information on that. And with that, we don't have any further questions coming in from our attendees. Jeff, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to impart upon us?
Yeah, I've been around since this regulation was started. I've got a 518 phone number, meaning I was kind of born and raised in upstate New York, very close to where these regulators are. I have done several continuing education credit type courses. If you want to learn more, we can talk about it offline. This stuff is very fluid, but it will go forward. It will get passed. We did see the same thing happen back in 2017. And if anyone, if there's something that I can't answer, I have a direct line to the DFS and can get answers for you. And with that, we sincerely thank you for the time today. I know you took time out of your day to do this. We hope that it was valuable. And I think Alex's point earlier on, if you want to just get a free, no cost evaluation of where you stand today, reach out. We can help you out with that, and we'd love to further the conversation if there's any questions that weren't answered today.
Great. So thank you very much. So just to echo what Jeff said, thank you for joining us today. Hopefully this was useful. And if you'd like any additional information about Arctic Wolf Networks, Winslow's North Star MS, or any of our assessments, please drop us a note at webinars, that's plural, at winslowtg.com. Till next time, be well and stay safe.